In the sterile conference room of Sterling Tech Solutions, a brilliant cybersecurity analyst was about to face the most devastating performance review of her career. What started as routine feedback took a shocking turn when she came face to face with calculated psychological warfare that would shatter her professional world. Sarah Mitchell wasn't your typical IT employee. For 3 years, she had dedicated her life to protecting corporate systems from digital predators, known for her methodical precision and uncompromising ethics. When her narcissistic boss systematically dismantled her confidence using clinical language and public humiliation, she had no idea she was about to cross every moral boundary she'd once defended, unleashing a digital vendetta that would consume both hunter and prey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell straightened the stack of security assessment reports one final time before entering conference room B. Her polished black flats clicked against the sterile linoleum with measured precision, a rhythm that had always calmed her nerves during her 3 years at Sterling Tech Solutions. Today's annual performance review should be routine, perhaps even triumphant. Her cybersecurity initiatives had prevented 2 major breaches this quarter, alone, saving the company millions in potential damages and regulatory fines. The conference room's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the mahogany table, where Robert Sterling sat flanked by 3 colleagues: Janet from operations, Mike from legal, and Tom from finance. Their presence surprised Sarah. Performance reviews were typically one-on-one affairs. She forced a professional smile, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her ear as she settled into the chair across from her boss. "Sarah," Robert began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth that had charmed clients and board members alike. At 45, he possessed the kind of effortless charisma that commanded boardrooms: silver-touched temples, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that suggested he held all the answers. "Thank you for joining us today. I thought it would be valuable to have multiple perspectives on your unique contributions to our team." The word unique hung in the air with deliberate weight. Sarah's chest tightened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Of course. I've prepared a summary of this year's security implementations and their impact on— Actually, let's start with something else." Robert leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Your colleagues here have shared some interesting observations about your work style and interpersonal dynamics." Sarah's hands grew clammy against the leather portfolio in her lap. She glanced at the 3 witnesses, noting how they avoided her gaze, their discomfort palpable. Janet picked at her nail polish. Mike studied his legal pad with unusual intensity. Tom shifted in his seat like a child caught in a lie. "I'm not sure I understand," Sarah said, her voice smaller than intended. Robert's smile widened, predatory now rather than warm. "Well, for instance, your tendency toward social isolation. Janet mentioned how you rarely participate in team-building activities or casual conversations. Mike noted your, let's call them, obsessive tendencies regarding security protocols. And Tom observed your difficulty accepting feedback that challenges your methodical approach." Each word was carefully chosen, clinically delivered, yet devastating in its precision. Sarah felt the familiar flush of childhood humiliation creeping up her neck, the same sensation she'd experienced in 7th grade when Ashley Brennan had loudly announced to the cafeteria that Sarah ate lunch alone because she was weird and probably crazy. "I prefer to focus on my work," Sarah managed, her analytical mind scrambling to understand the shift in dynamics. "My security audits have identified vulnerabilities that—" "Sarah?" Robert's voice carried a note of mock concern, the tone one might use with a confused child. "This fixation on work, this inability to form normal social connections, these are concerning patterns. Your colleagues have described behavior that suggests underlying psychological instability." The words hit like physical blows. Sarah's Carefully constructed professional facade began to crack. She could feel her breathing becoming shallow, her heart rate accelerating. Around the table, the witnesses shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke in her defense. I'm not unstable, Sarah protested, hating how her voice wavered. My work speaks for itself. The firewall implementations, the intrusion detection systems. Yes, your technical skills are adequate, Robert conceded with theatrical magnanimity. But leadership isn't just about technical competence. It's about emotional intelligence, social adaptability, mental resilience. Frankly, your pattern suggests someone who might be mentally unstable, socially deficient. He delivered the clinical terms with surgical precision, each syllable designed to wound. Sarah's vision blurred at the edges as panic clawed at her chest. This wasn't feedback. It was character assassination, performed with the calculated cruelty of someone who understood exactly how to weaponize vulnerability. Your methodical approach, while sometimes useful, often borders on compulsive behavior, Robert continued, consulting notes that Sarah now realized had been prepared specifically for this ambush. Your inability to engage in normal workplace interactions raises questions about your psychological fitness for increased responsibilities. Sarah's childhood rushed back with crushing clarity. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room, the invitations that never came. The way her mother had sighed when explaining that some children were just different. She'd thought she'd left that behind, thought her expertise and dedication had earned her respect and belonging. Instead, she'd walked into a trap. I don't understand why you're doing this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Robert's expression shifted to one of paternal disappointment. Sarah, denial is often the first sign of deeper issues. Perhaps you should consider seeking professional help. We certainly can't recommend you for the senior analyst position, while these concerns remain unaddressed. The promotion she'd been working toward for 2 years, the validation she'd craved, dissolved before her eyes. Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech that seemed to echo her internal scream. This meeting is concluded, Robert announced to the room, already turning his attention to his phone as if Sarah had simply evaporated. Janet, can you send me those Q3 projections? The dismissal was final. Absolute. Sarah stumbled toward the door, her professional composure finally shattering. In the hallway, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the darkened window. Pale, shaken, defeated. She looked exactly like the broken girl she'd once been. Her office felt like a sanctuary and a prison simultaneously. Sarah collapsed into her chair, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just occurred. The methodical, logical part of her mind, the part that had earned her a degree from Carnegie Mellon and built her career, began dissecting the attack with clinical precision. This hadn't been a performance review. It had been a calculated demolition, orchestrated with the kind of psychological sophistication that required planning and malice. Robert had used her colleagues as weapons, her personality traits as ammunition, and her deepest insecurities as targets. As her breathing gradually slowed, a new emotion began to surface beneath the hurt and humiliation. Anger, cold and sharp, crystallized in her chest. For the first time in her life, Sarah Mitchell began to understand the difference between justice and revenge, and why traditional channels of protection might not be enough to defend against someone who wielded psychology. Like a scalpel, outside her office, the corporate machine continued its relentless rhythm, indifferent to her pain. But something fundamental had shifted in the carefully ordered world of Sterling Tech Solutions. Sarah stared at her computer screen. It's black, reflection showing a face she barely recognized. Someone who had just learned that playing by the rules meant nothing when your opponent held all the cards. The seeds of digital vindication had been planted in that sterile conference room, watered by humiliation and fertilized by rage. Sarah didn't yet know what would grow from them, but she was certain of one thing. Robert Sterling had made a critical error in judgment. He'd exposed her vulnerabilities while revealing his own capacity for cruelty, and Sarah Mitchell had built her career on identifying weaknesses in systems that appeared impenetrable. Sarah's hands still trembled against the keyboard when the gentle knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She quickly minimized the browser window displaying workplace harassment legal definitions and called out with forced steadiness, "Come in." Marcus Thompson's broad frame filled the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. At 38, the former military cybersecurity specialist carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced real danger and emerged stronger. His presence immediately shifted the energy in Sarah's cramped office from suffocating isolation to something approaching safety. "Hey," he said softly, closing the door behind him. "Saw you leave the conference room looking like you'd seen a ghost. Everything okay?" Sarah attempted a professional smile, the same mask she'd perfected over years of feeling like an outsider. "Just a routine performance review. Nothing to worry about." Marcus's dark eyes, the kind that had learned to read people under pressure, in Baghdad and Kabul, studied her face. He'd been the first person at Sterling Tech to treat her as an equal rather than an oddity. Their shared expertise in cybersecurity, creating an immediate bond that had slowly developed into genuine friendship over the past 18 months. "Sarah." His voice carried the patience of someone accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant sources. "I've been doing this long enough to recognize when someone's been through psychological warfare. Want to tell me what really happened? In there?" The kindness in his tone nearly broke her remaining composure. Sarah's carefully constructed defenses crumbled as she found herself recounting the ambush in Conference Room B. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. "That son of a bitch," he muttered when she finished. "Sarah, what Robert did, that wasn't a performance review. That was a systematic character assassination. I know." Her voice came out smaller than intended. "But knowing it and proving it are different things. He's a senior VP. She gestured helplessly at her modest office, its walls lined with cybersecurity certifications that suddenly felt meaningless. Marcus pulled up the spare chair, positioning himself at eye level with her. "You're just what? One of the most brilliant security analysts I've ever worked with? The person who single-handedly prevented 2 major breaches this quarter? The woman who identified the vulnerability in our customer database that could have cost us everything?" He called me mentally unstable. The words escaped like a confession, carrying the weight of every childhood taunt, every moment of feeling, different and broken. In front of witnesses, said I was socially deficient. Jesus Christ. Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair. "You know what this reminds me of? Psychological operations we used to study in the military. Break down the target's sense of self. Isolate them from support systems. Make them question their own reality. Classic manipulation tactics." Sarah looked up sharply. "You think this was intentional? Planned?" "I think Robert Sterling is a political animal who sees you as a threat to something, maybe that promotion you've been working toward. And I think he's smart enough to know that outright discrimination would be actionable, so he went psychological instead." Marcus leaned forward. "Tell me, has he ever done anything like this before?" Sarah's analytical mind began connecting patterns she'd previously dismissed. "He's made comments, nothing overt, but little digs about my intensity or social limitations. I thought he was just being honest about areas for improvement. That's how it starts. Death by 1,000 cuts." Marcus's expression hardened with recognition. "I've seen this before in military units. Commanders who couldn't fire someone outright but wanted them gone. They'd create a hostile environment, make the target doubt themselves until they either broke or quit." The validation hit Sarah like a physical relief. For the first time since leaving the conference room, she felt her breathing return to normal. So I'm not crazy? I'm not reading too much into this? You're not crazy, Marcus said firmly. You're under attack. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Sarah's fingers unconsciously moved toward her keyboard. I could file a complaint with HR. Document the pattern of behavior. You could, Marcus agreed, though his tone suggested skepticism. Jennifer Harrison seems decent enough, but she's also trying to climb the corporate ladder. Going up against a senior VP is risky for someone in her position. Then what? Frustration bled into Sarah's voice. Just accept it? Let him destroy my career because he feels like it? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the intensity that had made him exceptional at threat assessment. You know, in the military, we had a saying, know your enemy better than they know themselves. Information is power, especially when you're outgunned. What do you mean? I mean, Robert Sterling presents this perfect corporate image, but nobody's that clean. Everyone has vulnerabilities, weak points, things they don't want exposed. Marcus's voice took on the tactical precision of his military background. The trick is finding them without compromising your own integrity. Sarah felt something stir in her chest, not quite hope, but something sharper and more dangerous. You're talking about investigating him? I'm talking about protecting yourself, understanding what you're up against. Marcus stood, his expression serious. But Sarah, if you go down this road, you need to be smart about it. Don't let anger make you sloppy. Don't become the thing you're fighting. After he left, Sarah sat in the growing darkness of her office, her computer screen casting blue light across her face. The workplace harassment articles she'd been reading seemed inadequate now, too passive, too trusting in systems that clearly favored people like Robert Sterling. She opened a new browser window and began typing, her cybersecurity expertise guiding her fingers toward darker corners of information gathering. Within minutes, she'd accessed the company directory, employee insurance records, and basic background information. All perfectly legal, all within her authorized access levels. Robert Sterling's file revealed the standard corporate biography. MBA from Wharton, 15 years of progressive leadership roles, currently residing in Westchester County. Divorced as of 8 months ago. Interesting timing, given his recent behavioral changes. One child, a 16-year-old son named David. Sarah's pulse quickened as she discovered something more intriguing. Regular monthly charges to Harmony Wellness Center billed through the company's executive health insurance plan. A quick search revealed Dr. Amanda Walsh's practice, specializing in executive coaching and addiction recovery. Therapy sessions. Robert Sterling, the man who'd just questioned her mental stability, was seeing a therapist himself. The irony was delicious, but more importantly, it was information. Sarah stared at the screen, her analytical mind already, calculating possibilities. Insurance records would contain appointment schedules, billing patterns, maybe even diagnostic codes. Her security clearance gave her access to financial systems that most employees couldn't touch. Marcus's words echoed in her mind. Know your enemy better than they know themselves. But alongside his advice came his warning. Don't become the thing you're fighting. Sarah's finger hovered over the keyboard, poised between righteousness and revenge. The boundary between gathering information and crossing ethical lines had never seemed thinner. In the fluorescent-lit quiet of her office, she made her first small step across that line, telling herself it was just research, just understanding the playing field. She was still Sarah Mitchell, ethical cybersecurity analyst. She was just being thorough. The lie felt almost true in the gathering darkness. Sarah stared at her reflection in the black computer screen, watching her moral certainty fracture like glass under pressure. 3 days had passed since Marcus left her office, and she'd spent each evening diving deeper into the digital rabbit hole that had opened before her. What started as research had evolved into something more methodical, more invasive. Sarah told herself she was gathering evidence for HR, building a case that would protect not just her, but future victims of Robert's psychological warfare. The rationalization came easier now, each justification smoothing the path toward the next transgression. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through Sterling Tech's interconnected systems like a ghost in The Machine. Years of cybersecurity work had given her administrative access to financial databases, insurance systems, and network logs that most employees never knew existed. She wasn't technically breaking any rules. Her clearance level permitted this access for legitimate security purposes. The definition of legitimate had become remarkably flexible. Robert Sterling's digital footprint painted the picture of a man whose perfect corporate facade masked troubling patterns. The insurance claims revealed a disturbing frequency of therapy sessions, weekly appointments that had increased to twice weekly following his divorce 8 months ago. The billing code suggested specialized treatment for substance abuse and personality disorders. Sarah's pulse quickened as she cross-referenced the therapy appointments with Robert's calendar system. The correlation was perfect. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, blocked time labeled External Meeting, RWS. She'd cracked his personal scheduling code within hours. Robert William Sterling, a man whose arrogance extended even to his calendar encryption. But the real treasure lay in the network access logs. Robert's corporate device showed regular connections to various personal accounts, banking, legal services, and most intriguingly, a private email server hosted through a service that specialized in discrete communications. Sarah's cybersecurity expertise allowed her to trace the digital breadcrumbs with surgical precision. She discovered the server architecture for Harmony Wellness Center during her lunch break, her ham sandwich growing cold as she mapped Dr. Amanda Walsh's surprisingly sophisticated patient management system. The therapist had invested in military-grade encryption for client files. Admirable, but not impenetrable to someone with Sarah's skills and administrative access to the insurance network that connected to their billing system. "Still here, Sarah?" Marcus's voice from the doorway made her jump, her hands instinctively minimizing windows with guilty efficiency. He stood silhouetted against the hallway light, his expression unreadable in the dim glow of her office. "Just finishing up some security assessments," she said, forcing casual confidence into her voice. "You know how it is. Vulnerabilities don't rest." Marcus stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "Mind if I ask what kind of vulnerabilities you're assessing at 8:30 at night?" Sarah's mind raced through plausible explanations, but Marcus's penetrating stare suggested he already suspected the truth. Their friendship had been built on mutual respect and transparency, qualities that now felt like liabilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I've been looking into Robert's background," she admitted, deciding that partial honesty might preserve their trust. "Just trying to understand what I'm dealing with." "And what have you found?" "He's seeing a therapist. Twice a week. The insurance claims suggest substance abuse treatment." Sarah watched Marcus's expression carefully. "Kind of ironic, considering his assessment of my mental stability." Marcus settled into the spare chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "That's interesting information. How exactly did you come by it?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the weight of her choices pressing down, each small transgression accumulating into something that might be irreversible. "Insurance databases. I have legitimate access for security audits." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "I'm not doing anything illegal." "Legal and ethical aren't always the same thing," Marcus said quietly. "You know that better than most." Sarah's defensive mechanisms activated automatically. He destroyed my career prospects in front of witnesses, called me mentally unstable. And you want me to worry about ethics? I want you to remember who you are. Marcus leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen good people make irreversible choices. Sarah, I've watched soldiers go down this road. It starts with justifiable anger, moves to justified retaliation, and ends in places you never intended to go. This is different. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're using your security clearance to violate someone's privacy for personal reasons. Marcus's tone remained gentle, but his words cut deep. That's not gathering evidence. That's surveillance. Sarah's anger flared, fueled by 3 days of growing obsession and righteous indignation. So what's the alternative? File a complaint. With HR and hope they take my word against a senior VP? Wait for him to destroy the next person who threatens his ego? Maybe. Or maybe you find another way to fight that doesn't compromise everything you've worked to build. Marcus stood, his disappointment palpable. Sarah, you're brilliant, dedicated, and ethical. Don't let Robert Sterling take that away from you. After he left, Sarah sat alone in the darkness, her computer screen casting blue shadows across the office walls. Marcus's words echoed in her mind, but they competed with a stronger voice, one that whispered about justice denied and power protected by institutional indifference. She opened the Harmony Wellness Center's network architecture diagram, studying the elegant security protocols that Dr. Walsh had implemented. The system was well designed, but not perfect. Sarah identified 3 potential entry points: the billing interface that connected to insurance networks, the appointment scheduling system that synchronized with calendar applications, and the encrypted backup server that stored archived session recordings. The recordings. Dr. Walsh's practice notes had mentioned digital session records, stored for legal compliance and patient continuity. Those files would contain Robert's unfiltered thoughts, his genuine struggles and manipulative patterns laid bare without the corporate mask he wore so skillfully. Sarah's fingers hesitated over the keyboard as Marcus's warning battled with her, growing hunger for vindication. She thought about the promotion she'd lost, the humiliation she'd endured, the colleagues who'd witnessed her destruction in silence. She thought about future victims who might suffer Robert's psychological warfare. But mostly, she thought about power, how Robert wielded it with casual cruelty, and how she might finally possess some of her own. The first probe into Harmony. Wellness Center's security perimeter was subtle, a routine vulnerability scan that could be explained as due diligence for Sterling Tech's insurance compliance. Sarah told herself she was just testing their defenses, evaluating whether their patient data was properly protected. When the scan revealed an exploitable weakness in their appointment synchronization system, she told herself she was obligated to investigate further. When she successfully accessed the scheduling database, she told herself she was gathering evidence. And when she downloaded Robert Sterling's complete appointment history, including session notes and diagnostic codes, she told herself she was serving justice. The lie felt completely true in the gathering darkness. 3 miles away, in the warmly lit office of Harmony Wellness Center, Dr. Amanda Walsh adjusted the audio recording equipment that would capture the next 45 minutes of Robert Sterling's psychological unraveling. She had no idea that digital predators were already circling her carefully protected sanctuary. "Robert, how are you feeling today?" Dr. Walsh settled into her ergonomic chair, her practiced eye noting the telltale signs of his deteriorating state. Bloodshot eyes suggesting another sleepless night, the slight tremor in his hands that indicated either withdrawal or anxiety, and the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the scent of alcohol from the night before. Robert Sterling sprawled in the leather recliner across from her, his usual corporate armor replaced by casual clothes that somehow made him appear smaller, more vulnerable. At 45, stripped of his boardroom confidence, he resembled nothing so much as an overgrown child struggling with emotions too large for his understanding. "I'm fine," he said automatically. then caught himself. Sorry. I know you hate when I say that. I don't hate anything you say, Robert, but fine tells me very little about your internal experience. Dr. Walsh's voice carried the professional warmth she'd cultivated over 15 years of practice. You missed our Friday session. That's the third cancellation this month. Robert's jaw tightened defensively. I had work obligations. Sterling Tech doesn't run itself. Of course, though I notice your cancellations often coincide with our more challenging sessions. Dr. Walsh made a note on her tablet, the stylus, scratching softly. Last Tuesday, we were discussing your workplace relationships and how they mirror patterns from your childhood. Look, Amanda, Dr. Walsh, I don't need to psychoanalyze every interaction I have with my employees. Robert's voice carried an edge of the intimidation tactics that worked so well in corporate settings. Some people are just difficult to work with. Tell me about the difficult people. Robert's laugh held no humor. Where do I start? Sarah Mitchell, for instance. Brilliant with computers, but completely incapable of basic human interaction. I tried to give her honest feedback during her review, and she basically had a breakdown right there in the conference room. Dr. Walsh leaned forward slightly, her professional instincts detecting the shift in Robert's tone when he mentioned Sarah's name. There was something predatory there, a satisfaction that troubled her. When you say honest feedback, what specifically did you tell her? The truth. Robert's voice took on the self-righteous quality that Dr. Walsh had learned to recognize as his defense mechanism. That her antisocial behavior and obsessive tendencies suggest underlying psychological issues. That someone with her mental instability isn't suited for leadership positions. I see. Dr. Walsh made another note, her expression carefully neutral. Robert, can you help me understand the difference between what you told Sarah and what we've discussed about your own struggles with social anxiety and perfectionism? The question hung in the air like a mirror held up to Robert's face. His composure cracked slightly, revealing the frightened child beneath the manipulative executive. That's completely different. I'm seeking help for my issues. I'm self-aware, enough to work on them. His voice rose defensively. Sarah's in denial about her problems. Is she? Or might she simply be managing them differently than you do? Dr. Walsh's tone remained gentle, but her words carried surgical precision. You've mentioned using alcohol to cope with social situations. You've described manipulating conversations to maintain control when you feel threatened. How is your behavior fundamentally different from hers? Robert's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening. Because I'm not mentally unstable, I don't have breakdowns in meetings, I don't isolate myself from normal human contact. You isolate yourself through manipulation and control. You have breakdowns. You just hide them behind closed doors and numb them with alcohol. Dr. Walsh's voice remained steady, unflinching. Robert, what you described doing to Sarah sounds like you projected your own insecurities onto her and then punished her for reflecting back what you hate about yourself. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft hum of the recording equipment. Robert's breathing became labored, his careful facade crumbling under the weight of unwelcome insight. She threatens you, Dr. Walsh continued. Her competence, her authenticity, her ability to find value in work rather than in controlling others. So you tried to destroy what you couldn't possess or control. That's not... I was giving her honest feedback. You were eliminating a threat using psychological warfare. Dr. Walsh's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine concern. Robert, this is exactly the pattern we've discussed regarding your ex-wife, your custody battles, your relationship with David. When you feel threatened or abandoned, you attack the other person's sense of self. Robert's composure finally shattered completely. Maybe because everyone abandons me, my parents, my wife, my son. Everyone leaves. So, excuse me for protecting myself. By hurting others first? By being realistic about human nature? Tears leaked from Robert's eyes, though his voice remained bitter. People only stay when they need something from you. The moment you show weakness, they're gone. Dr. Walsh softened her approach, recognizing the genuine pain beneath Robert's destructive patterns. When did you first learn that lesson? 8 years old? Maybe 9. Robert's voice became small, childlike. My father got laid off from the bank. Went from respected executive to broken man overnight. My mother, she stayed physically, but she checked out emotionally. Started drinking more, criticizing everything he did. I watched him shrink into nothing. And you decided never to be vulnerable like that. I decided never to be weak. Robert wiped, his eyes angrily. Every weakness becomes a weapon in someone else's hands. Sarah's awkwardness, her social anxiety. Those are weaknesses that would destroy her if she advanced. I was protecting the company. And protecting yourself from seeing your own reflection in her struggles. The session continued for another 20 minutes, Robert's defenses cycling between rage, manipulation, and genuine vulnerability. Dr. Walsh documented each revelation with clinical precision, her recording equipment capturing every word, every painful admission. She noted his increasing alcohol dependency, his manipulative patterns with colleagues, his genuine remorse about his son David's depression following the divorce. She recorded his admission that he'd sabotaged previous employees who reminded him of his own insecurities. Most damning of all, she captured his moment of honest insight. Maybe I do target people like Sarah because they remind me of everything I hate about myself. Maybe destroying them makes me feel powerful instead of pathetic. As Robert left her office, Dr. Walsh completed her session notes, unaware that every word had already been intercepted and recorded by someone whose thirst for justice had evolved into something far more dangerous. In her secure office, surrounded by certificates and diplomas attesting to her professional integrity, she had no idea that her sanctuary had been violated by a woman whose moral compass was spinning wildly, off true north. The recording equipment fell silent, but the damage had been done. Somewhere in the digital darkness, Sarah Mitchell was about to discover that the most devastating truths often came wrapped in the voices of those who confessed them freely. Dr. Walsh locked her office door, her professional duty complete. Never, knowing that her patient's deepest secrets were already racing through fiber optic cables toward an increasingly dangerous recipient. 40 minutes later, in the sterile glow of her office at Sterling Tech, Sarah Mitchell pressed play on an audio file that would forever change the trajectory of her moral compass. The timestamp showed 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, exactly when Robert's calendar indicated his therapy appointment. Sarah had spent the better part of a week infiltrating Harmony Wellness Center's backup servers, each step feeling like a small victory over a system that had failed to protect her. The final breach had been elegant in its simplicity, a vulnerability. In their automatic cloud synchronization that uploaded session recordings for disaster recovery purposes. Robert's voice filled her office through noise-canceling headphones, raw and vulnerable in a way she'd never heard before. Sarah's analytical mind cataloged each revelation with methodical precision, but her emotional core trembled with something between vindication and horror. Sarah Mitchell, brilliant with computers but completely incapable of basic human interaction. The clinical dissection of her character stung even in this context, but what followed was pure gold. Robert's admission that he'd deliberately targeted her psychological vulnerabilities, his confession about projecting his own insecurities onto her, his revelation that destroying employees like her made him feel powerful instead of pathetic. Sarah paused the recording, her hands shaking as she transcribed the most damning quotes into a secure document. This was it, proof of his manipulative behavior, evidence of his psychological instability, validation that her humiliation had been calculated rather than deserved. But as she continued listening, the simple narrative of victim and villain became increasingly complex. Robert's voice cracked as he described watching his father's destruction, his terror of vulnerability, his genuine remorse about failing his son David. Maybe I do target people like Sarah because they remind me of everything I hate about myself. The admission should have felt like triumph. Instead, Sarah found herself confronting an uncomfortable truth. Robert Sterling wasn't a monster. He was a deeply damaged man whose pain had metastasized into cruelty. The realization didn't excuse his behavior, but it complicated her growing thirst for revenge. She accessed the next file, a session from the previous week where Robert discussed his custody battle. His ex-wife had filed for sole custody, citing his emotional instability and pattern of psychological manipulation. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The man who'd questioned her mental fitness was losing his own family for the same reasons. "David won't even look at me anymore," Robert's recorded voice confessed. "Last weekend visit, he spent the entire time in his room, said I'm toxic, and he doesn't want to end up like me." Sarah's finger hovered over the pause button as she listened to Robert break down completely, sobbing about his failures as a father. This wasn't the calculating executive who'd destroyed her confidence. This was a broken man facing the consequences of his own psychological warfare. The session recordings painted a disturbing pattern spanning months. Robert had targeted at least 3 other employees in similar ways, always choosing those who reminded him of his own vulnerabilities. A junior analyst with social anxiety who'd been reassigned after Robert questioned his stability. A marketing coordinator with perfectionist tendencies who'd been driven to resign after Robert publicly criticized her obsessive attention to detail. Sarah's cybersecurity training had taught her to think systematically, and the pattern was unmistakable. Robert Sterling was a serial psychological predator who used his position to eliminate threats to his fragile ego. The recordings contained enough evidence to destroy his career, expose his manipulative patterns, and potentially support criminal charges for workplace harassment. But they also contained something else: details about David's depression, his struggles with his parents, divorce, his therapy sessions to address the emotional damage from his father's toxic behavior. Robert's genuine anguish about his son's suffering was perhaps the only authentic emotion she'd heard in hours of recordings. Sarah opened a new browser window and searched for David Sterling's social media profiles. The 16-year-old's Instagram revealed a typical teenager's life: school events, friend gatherings, carefully curated moments of happiness. But his more recent posts carried darker undertones: song lyrics about abandonment, subtle references to family dysfunction, and a concerning number of posts about mental health struggles. One particular image stopped her cold. David at what appeared to be a therapy session, captioned, "Some wounds take longer to heal. Mental health matters. Family trauma." The timestamp was from 3 days ago. Sarah stared at the screen, her righteous anger beginning to curdle into something more complex. Using these recordings would devastate Robert professionally and personally, but it would also expose David's struggles to public scrutiny. The teenager was already casualties of his father's psychological issues. Sarah's revenge would make him collateral damage in a war he'd never asked to join. She returned to the therapy recordings, fast-forwarding through sessions until she found what she was looking for: Robert's discussion of his alcohol dependency. The details were clinically precise: daily drinking to manage anxiety, missed custody visits due to intoxication, a DUI arrest that had been quietly handled through corporate legal channels. "I know I'm destroying everything I touch," Robert's voice confessed through the headphones. "David, my marriage, my employees, I turn everything toxic because I'm terrified of being vulnerable." Sarah removed the headphones, the sudden silence of her office feeling oppressive after hours of digital intimacy with her tormentor's psyche. She possessed enough ammunition to utterly destroy Robert Sterling, but the cost was becoming clear. Victory would require weaponizing the private confessions of a man seeking help, violating the trust of an ethical therapist, and potentially harming an innocent teenager. Her computer screen displayed dozens of downloaded files, therapy sessions, diagnostic notes, treatment plans, all obtained through sophisticated cyber intrusion that would be impossible to trace back to her. She'd covered her digital tracks with the expertise of someone who'd spent years protecting systems from people exactly like herself. The irony was suffocating. In her quest to expose Robert's psychological manipulation, she'd become a digital predator herself. She'd violated doctor-patient confidentiality, breached multiple computer systems, and stolen private medical records. The woman who'd built her career on ethical cybersecurity had crossed every line she'd once defended. Sarah opened her secure notes application and began organizing the most damaging evidence. Robert's confession about targeting vulnerable employees, his admission of deliberate psychological warfare, his pattern of workplace harassment spanning multiple victims. She had enough to file criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and professional complaints that would end his career permanently. But as she worked, David Sterling's face haunted her thoughts. The teenager's social media posts about family trauma, his therapy sessions, his struggle to understand why his father had become a monster. Using this evidence would expose every shameful detail of the Sterling family's dysfunction to public consumption. The choice crystallized before her with brutal clarity: justice for herself and Robert's other victims, or protection for an innocent child caught in the crossfire. Sarah's fingers hesitated over the keyboard, poised between vindication and violation, between revenge and responsibility. For the first time since her humiliation began, she understood that power corrupted not through dramatic choices, but through small compromises, each rationalization making the next transgression easier. She'd told herself she was gathering evidence, then seeking justice, then protecting future victims. Now she had to decide whether she'd become the monster she was fighting, or find a way back to the ethical person she'd once been. The recordings waited in digital silence, patient as loaded weapons in the hands of someone who'd forgotten the difference between justice and revenge. Sarah stared at her reflection in the black computer screen, watching her moral certainty dissolve like sugar in rain. 2 weeks had passed since she'd first breached Dr. Walsh's systems, and the weight of her stolen knowledge had transformed her into someone she barely recognized. "Sarah, we need to talk." Marcus's voice cut through her contemplation like a blade. She hadn't heard him enter, her attention consumed by the damning evidence spread across multiple encrypted folders on her desktop. His reflection appeared, behind hers in the monitor, weathered face etched with concern and something that looked uncomfortably like disappointment. "You're here early," she said, minimizing windows with practiced efficiency. The guilty motion wasn't lost on either of them. "It's 8:30. I've been here since 7. Marcus moved into her office, closing the door with deliberate care. "Question is, when did you leave last night?" "Security logs show your badge accessing the building at 11 p.m. Sarah's pulse quickened. If Marcus was checking security logs, he suspected more than late-night dedication. "I couldn't sleep. Figured I might as well be productive." "Productive? Doing what exactly?" Marcus settled into the spare chair, his posture carrying the alert tension of someone prepared for conflict. "Because I've been monitoring network traffic, and there's been some interesting activity originating from your workstation." The words hit Sarah like ice water. Marcus wasn't just concerned, he was investigating her. Their friendship, built on mutual respect and shared ethical principles, had become a casualty of her descent into digital vigilantism. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Marcus's voice carried the authority of his military background, unauthorized access to insurance databases, probing external medical networks, and enough suspicious traffic to constitute a security breach. "Want to explain?" Sarah's mind raced through possible explanations, but Marcus's penetrating stare suggested he already knew more than he was revealing. The man who'd taught her about psychological warfare had apparently learned to recognize when it was being deployed against him. "I filed an HR complaint against Robert," she said, opting for partial truth. "I needed evidence to support my case." "And did you find it?" The question hung between them like a trap. Sarah realized that Marcus was giving her an opportunity to confess, to step back from whatever precipice she'd approached. But the weight of Robert's recorded confessions felt too heavy to abandon. "Yes," she whispered. Marcus nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "What kind of evidence, Sarah?" "Proof that he's done this before, that he targets vulnerable employees systematically, that his behavior constitutes a pattern of workplace harassment." The words tumbled out in a rush, each revelation feeling like both confession and justification. "How did you obtain this? Proof?" The simple question shattered Sarah's remaining pretenses. Marcus wasn't asking about her methods. He was forcing her to confront them, to acknowledge that she'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "Does it matter?" she said defensively. "Robert Sterling is a psychological predator who's destroyed multiple careers. Someone needs to stop him." "And you appointed yourself, judge and jury?" Marcus's voice remained steady, but disappointment leaked through his professional composure. "Sarah, what you're describing sounds like vigilante justice dressed up as righteous investigation. He called me mentally unstable, in front of witnesses. He's using his position to systematically destroy people who threaten his ego." Sarah's voice rose, fed by weeks of accumulated rage and justification. "The system failed to protect me, so I protected myself." "By becoming him?" The accusation hit harder than any physical blow. Sarah recoiled as if Marcus had struck her defensive mechanisms activating with desperate intensity. "I'm nothing like him. I'm exposing the truth, not creating lies." "Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're using your technical skills to violate someone's privacy for personal reasons. You're weaponizing information obtained through illegal means." Marcus leaned forward, his expression pained. "That's not justice, Sarah. That's revenge." Before Sarah could respond, a sharp knock interrupted their confrontation. Jennifer Harrison's voice called through the door. "Sarah, I need to speak with you about your HR complaint." Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances, his concerned, hers panicked. The HR investigation had apparently moved faster than either of them expected. "Come in," Sarah called, her voice strained. Jennifer entered with the careful composure of someone navigating corporate politics. At 34, the HR director had cultivated an image of professional competence that masked her own struggles with competing loyalties. Her expression suggested this wasn't going to be a routine follow-up. "I've completed my preliminary investigation into your harassment complaint," Jennifer began, settling into the remaining chair. "I need to discuss some concerns about the evidence you've provided." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What kind of concerns?" "You've included very specific details about Robert's personal life, his therapy sessions, his family situation." Jennifer consulted her tablet, her tone carefully neutral. "Information that wouldn't be accessible through normal workplace channels." Marcus shot Sarah a warning look, but she was already committed to her course of action. The recordings had given her ammunition she couldn't resist using. "I documented patterns of behavior that extend beyond the workplace," Sarah said carefully. "His manipulation tactics, his targeting of vulnerable employees, his history of similar incidents." "How did you document these patterns?" Jennifer's question carried the weight of legal implications. Sarah felt the walls closing in. Jennifer's investigation had clearly uncovered more than routine harassment complaints. The HR director was probing for evidence of criminal activity, and Sarah's carefully constructed justifications were crumbling under professional scrutiny. "I used publicly available information and observable workplace behavior," Sarah lied, the words tasting like ash. Jennifer made a note on her tablet, her expression skeptical. Sarah, I need to ask directly. Have you accessed any confidential medical records, private communications, or personal information outside your authorized access levels? The question hung in the air like a judicial oath. Sarah realized that Jennifer wasn't just investigating Robert's harassment, she was building a case against Sarah's methods. The HR director had apparently discovered evidence of the privacy violations that Marcus had only suspected. I gathered information necessary to support my complaint, Sarah said evasively. That's not what I asked. Jennifer's voice hardened. With administrative authority. Have you accessed confidential information through unauthorized means? Marcus watched the exchange with growing alarm, his concern shifting from Sarah's methods to her potential criminal liability. The woman he'd tried to protect from Robert's psychological warfare had apparently committed serious federal crimes in pursuit of revenge. I think Sarah should consult with legal counsel before answering any more questions, Marcus interjected. Jennifer nodded gravely. That might be wise. Sarah, I'm suspending your system access pending completion of this investigation. Corporate security will need to examine your workstation and network activity. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her career, her access to the evidence she'd gathered, her ability to pursue justice against Robert, everything was being stripped away by the same institutional machinery that had failed to protect her in the first place. You're protecting him, Sarah said, desperation bleeding into her voice. Robert Sterling is a psychological predator, and you're protecting him because he's a senior VP. I'm following legal protocol, Jennifer replied firmly, which is something you should have considered before pursuing unauthorized investigations. As Jennifer left to arrange the security review, Sarah sat in stunned silence. Her quest for justice had transformed her into a criminal, alienated her closest friend, and potentially destroyed her career. The recordings that had seemed like salvation now felt like chains binding her to choices she couldn't undo. Marcus remained in his chair, studying her with the sad expression of someone watching a friend's self-destruction. Sarah, it's not too late to step back from this. Get a lawyer, cooperate with the investigation, try to salvage what you can. But Sarah's fingers were already moving toward her keyboard, her mind calculating how to preserve the evidence before corporate security locked her out. She'd crossed too many lines to retreat now, and the recordings contained truth too powerful to abandon. The moral compass that had once guided her career lay shattered at her feet, its pieces pointing in directions she no longer recognized. Sarah's fingers moved across her personal laptop keyboard with desperate precision, transferring the most critical files before corporate security could lock her out completely. 3 days had passed since Jennifer's ultimatum, and Sarah had spent every moment preparing for the inevitable reckoning. She'd moved her operation home, working through sleepless nights in her cramped apartment, surrounded by printouts and digital evidence that painted Robert Sterling as a serial psychological predator. But tonight, as she queued up the next therapy session recording, something in Robert's voice made her pause. David called yesterday, Robert's recorded voice said, heavy with exhaustion. First time in 2 weeks, but he hung up when I answered. Sarah's breath caught. She'd been so focused on Robert's confessions about workplace manipulation that she'd skimmed past the more personal revelations. Now, with criminal charges looming and her career in ruins, she found herself confronting the collateral damage she'd been avoiding. Tell me about that conversation, Dr. Walsh's voice prompted gently. There wasn't one, just silence. Then the line went dead. Robert's voice cracked with genuine pain. His mother says he's been having nightmares again, about the divorce, about the custody battle, about me. Sarah closed her eyes but couldn't block out the raw anguish in Robert's confession. This wasn't the manipulative executive she'd been hunting. This was a broken father, grappling with the destruction of his family. The nightmares started after that incident at school, Robert continued. When some kids found out about my problems, called him the son of a psycho, said mental illness runs in families. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. David Sterling was already paying the price for his father's psychological issues, and she was about to make it infinitely worse. The recordings she'd stolen contained intimate details about the teenager's therapy sessions, his struggles with depression, his fear that he'd inherited his father's toxic patterns. Sarah opened David's social media profiles again, studying them with new eyes. The carefully curated happiness she'd initially dismissed now looked like desperate performance, a 16-year-old's attempt to prove he was normal despite the chaos surrounding his family. His most recent post stopped her cold, a photo of him at a school counseling session with the caption, "Sometimes the sins of the fathers." Therapy? Healing? Not my destiny. The timestamp was from yesterday. "Dr. Walsh, I need to ask you something." Robert's voice continued from the recording. "David's therapist thinks he might benefit from family sessions together, but I'm terrified that seeing me in therapy will confirm his worst fears about mental illness." "What fears are those?" "That he's broken like me, that he'll grow up to hurt people the way I have." The confession was barely audible, choked with self-loathing. "Maybe he's right to be afraid. Maybe the kindest thing I could do is stay away from him completely." Sarah's analytical mind began connecting dots she'd been deliberately avoiding. The recordings she'd stolen didn't just contain evidence of Robert's workplace harassment. They contained a roadmap of David's psychological vulnerabilities, his therapy sessions, his desperate attempts to understand his father's behavior. If she released this evidence, David's private struggles would become public knowledge. His classmates would learn about his depression, his therapy sessions, his fears about inherited mental illness. The teenager who was already being bullied for having a psycho father would become the subject of even more vicious scrutiny. She accessed another recording, this one from 3 weeks ago, where Robert discussed David's suicide ideation. "He asked me if I ever thought about ending it all," Robert's voice whispered. "Just stopping the pain. And I didn't know how to answer because the honest answer is yes. Every day." Sarah's hands shook as she paused the recording. David Sterling wasn't just collateral damage. He was a vulnerable teenager who'd explicitly expressed suicidal thoughts. Exposing his father's secrets could push him over an edge he was already dangerously close to approaching. But the alternative felt equally devastating. Robert had destroyed multiple careers, manipulated vulnerable employees, and would likely continue his pattern of psychological warfare if she didn't act. How many other Sarah Mitchells would suffer while she protected one teenager's privacy? Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hi, is this Sarah Mitchell from Sterling Tech? This is David Sterling. I think we need to talk." Sarah stared at the message, her blood turning to ice. How had Robert's son gotten her personal number? What did he know about her investigation? Before she could respond, another message appeared. "I know you've been looking into my dad. I overheard him on the phone with his lawyer about corporate espionage charges. Please don't destroy what's left of our family." The plea hit Sarah with devastating force. David wasn't just collateral damage. He was actively aware of her investigation and begging her to stop. The 16-year-old was trying to protect his father despite everything Robert had put him through. Sarah's fingers hesitated over her phone's keyboard. She could ignore the message, proceed with her plans, and let David become another casualty of adult conflicts. Or she could acknowledge that her quest for justice had evolved into something that would traumatize an innocent child. Another message appeared. "I know he's messed up. I know he's hurt people. But he's still my dad, and he's trying to get better. The therapy is helping. Please don't take that away from him." Sarah closed her laptop and walked to her apartment window, staring out at the city lights that blurred through her tears. She'd spent weeks telling herself that exposing Robert was about justice, about protecting future victims, about holding powerful people accountable for their actions. But David's messages forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. She was no longer motivated by justice. She was driven by revenge, by the need to make Robert suffer the way she had suffered. And that revenge would inevitably destroy an innocent teenager who was already struggling to survive his father's toxicity. She returned to her laptop and opened the therapy recordings again, but this time she listened for references to David. The details were heartbreaking. A sensitive teenager trapped between loving an abusive father and protecting himself from that same man's psychological damage. David asked me why I hurt people, Robert's voice confessed in one session. Why? I can't just be normal like other dads. And I realized that all his problems, the depression, the anxiety, the social isolation, they're all because of me. He's carrying the weight of my psychological damage. Dr. Walsh's response was gentle but direct. Robert, children often internalize their parents' emotional struggles. David's healing depends partly on your healing. Sarah understood with crushing clarity that destroying Robert's therapy progress wouldn't just harm the man who'd humiliated her, it would also destroy his son's only hope for family recovery. The recordings she'd stolen weren't just evidence of past crimes. They were documentation of ongoing healing that she had the power to either protect or obliterate. Her phone buzzed again. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to remember that some battles have innocent casualties. Please don't let me be one of them. Sarah stared at David's message until the words blurred together. She'd become so focused on winning her war against Robert that she'd forgotten the human cost of victory. The teenager reaching out to her was everything she'd once been. Vulnerable, isolated, desperately trying to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush sensitive souls. For the first time since her humiliation began, Sarah Mitchell had to decide whether justice was worth destroying the very type of person she'd originally set out to protect. The recordings waited in digital silence, but now they felt less like weapons and more like chains binding her to a choice that would define who she truly was. Sarah had been staring at David's messages for hours when the sharp knock at her apartment door shattered her contemplation. The clock read 9:47 p.m., too late for casual visitors, too early for emergencies. Through the peephole, she saw Robert Sterling standing in her hallway, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled by stress and desperation. His corporate armor had been replaced by jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt, making him look smaller, more human than the predator she'd been hunting. I know you're in there, Sarah, his voice carried through the door, stripped of its usual commanding authority. We need to talk about what you've stolen. Sarah's hands trembled as she considered her options. She could ignore him, call the police, or face the confrontation that had been building since her first breach of Dr. Walsh's systems. After weeks of digital warfare, the enemy had finally materialized on her doorstep. She opened the door with the security chain still attached, studying Robert through the narrow gap. His eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion and what looked like recent tears. The man who'd destroyed her confidence with calculated precision now appeared on the verge of his own breakdown. How did you find my address? She asked. Employee database. Same way you found my therapy appointments. Robert's voice carried bitter irony. Seems we both have access to information we shouldn't. Sarah released the chain and stepped back, allowing him into her apartment. The space felt contaminated by his presence, but she was past caring about boundaries. They'd been circling each other in the digital darkness for weeks. It was time to face each other in the light. Robert surveyed her apartment, noting the printed therapy transcripts scattered across her coffee table, the laptop displaying his recorded confessions. The evidence of her obsessive investigation spread like a shrine to his destruction. Jesus Christ, Sarah, look what you've become. His voice mixed disgust with something that might have been pity. Do you see what this has done to you? What I've become. Sarah's voice rose with weeks of suppressed rage. You destroyed my career, called me mentally unstable in front of witnesses, sabotaged my promotion, and you're concerned about what I've become? I made a mistake, Robert said quietly. A terrible, cruel mistake that I've been trying to address in therapy. But this? He gestured at the evidence surrounding them. This is criminal. You've violated doctor-patient confidentiality, hacked medical systems, stolen private records. You've become the predator you claim to be fighting. The accusation hit harder than Sarah expected because it contained a grain of truth she'd been avoiding. But her anger was too deep, too justified to be deflected by his psychological manipulation. I became what you made me, she shot back. You want to talk about predators? Let's discuss your pattern of targeting vulnerable employees. The junior analyst you drove to resign, the marketing coordinator you psychologically demolished, How do you know about them? Robert's voice went cold with recognition. Those details aren't in any corporate files. They're in your therapy sessions. Every confession, every admission of guilt, every moment of genuine remorse. I have it all. Sarah moved to her laptop, her fingers hovering over the play button. Would you like to hear yourself admitting that you target people who remind you of your own weaknesses? Robert's face went ashen. You can't have accessed those files. They're encrypted, protected by security protocols designed to keep out amateurs. Unfortunately for you, I'm not an amateur. Sarah's voice carried the cold satisfaction of superior technical expertise. I know about your alcohol dependency, your custody battle, your father's destruction that turned you into this. I know about David's nightmares, his depression, his fear that he's inherited your psychological damage. The mention of his son hit Robert like a physical blow. He staggered backward, gripping the doorframe for support as the full scope of her violation became clear. My son, he whispered. You have recordings about my son. Hours of them. His therapy sessions, his suicidal ideation, his desperate attempts to understand why his father became a monster. Sarah's voice turned vicious with accumulated rage. Ironic, isn't it? The man who questioned my mental stability is raising a teenager who contemplates suicide because of your psychological abuse. Robert's composure shattered completely. You can't use that. He's a child. Whatever you think I deserve, David is innocent in this. Innocent? Sarah laughed harshly. Tell that to all the employees you've destroyed. Tell that to me when you humiliated me in front of my colleagues. Where was your concern for innocence then? I was wrong. Robert's voice cracked with desperation. I was projecting my own self-hatred onto you, using my position to eliminate threats to my fragile ego. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that, helped me see the pattern. I've been trying to change, trying to make amends. Too little, too late. Sarah moved toward her phone, her intention clear. I'm releasing everything. The workplace harassment, the alcohol abuse, the manipulation tactics, all of it. Let's see how your precious career survives the truth. The truth? Robert's voice turned dangerous, his desperation transforming into something more familiar, the calculating cruelty she'd experienced in the conference room. You want to talk about truth? Let's discuss how you've spent weeks stalking me, violating federal privacy laws, and committing multiple felonies. Let's talk about how your quest for justice has turned you into exactly the kind of unstable individual I said you were. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Sarah felt her righteous anger wavering as Robert's psychological expertise turned on her with laser focus. Look around you, Sarah. Look at what you've become. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone skilled in psychological manipulation. Isolated from friends, obsessed with revenge, committing crimes to feed your need for vindication. This isn't justice. It's mental illness expressing itself through technical expertise. Stop, Sarah whispered, but Robert pressed his advantage with ruthless efficiency. You've proven everything I said about you in that conference room. The social isolation, the obsessive behavior, the inability to process criticism in a healthy way. The only difference is that now you have evidence of your instability in the form of federal crimes. Sarah's hands shook as Robert's words stripped away her moral justifications, revealing the hollow obsession beneath. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted their psychological warfare. Jennifer Harrison appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 corporate security officers and what appeared to be federal agents. Her expression mixed professional duty with genuine concern for both combatants. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Jennifer said formally, "but we've been monitoring communications about this situation. Sarah Mitchell, you're under arrest for multiple violations of federal computer fraud and abuse statutes. Robert Sterling, you're being served with a restraining order and suspended from Sterling Tech, pending investigation of workplace harassment charges." The confrontation that had been building for weeks ended not with resolution, but with mutual destruction. Sarah and Robert stared at each other across the wreckage of their professional lives, 2 damaged people who'd become each other's instrument of downfall. In the silence that followed, David Sterling's plea echoed in Sarah's mind. "Please don't. Let me be one of them." She'd become so focused on winning her war against Robert that she'd forgotten the innocent casualties scattered in their wake. The battle was over, but Sarah wasn't sure who had won, or if victory was even possible when the cost included becoming the very thing you'd set out to destroy. 3 weeks had passed since the arrests, and the sterile conference room at Sterling Tech felt like a courtroom where multiple trials were being conducted simultaneously. Dr. Amanda Walsh sat at the far end of the table, her professional composure intact despite the violation of her practice that had thrust her into this corporate nightmare. The discovery that her patient management system had been breached had shaken her faith in digital security, but more importantly, it had forced her to confront the ethical implications of her detailed record-keeping. The forensic analysis confirms that Ms. Mitchell accessed our systems over a period of 3 weeks, Dr. Walsh explained to the assembled investigators, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. 37 therapy sessions were compromised, along with diagnostic notes, treatment plans, and correspondence with other healthcare providers. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Chen made notes on her tablet, her expression professionally neutral, as she documented what would become one of the most complex cybercrime cases of her career. The intersection of workplace harassment, medical privacy violations, and corporate espionage had created legal challenges that would require months to untangle. Dr. Walsh, can you help us understand the potential impact of this breach on your patient? Agent Chen asked. Dr. Walsh hesitated, caught between her professional obligation to protect Robert's privacy and her legal duty to cooperate with the investigation. Without violating confidentiality further, I can say that exposing these records would significantly damage both my patient's treatment progress and his family relationships. His teenage son has been particularly vulnerable during this period. Jennifer Harrison shifted uncomfortably in her chair, acutely aware that her HR investigation had helped precipitate this disaster. The workplace harassment complaint that should have been resolved through corporate channels had metastasized into federal crimes and psychological warfare that had destroyed multiple lives. What about the workplace harassment allegations? Jennifer asked. The recordings Ms. Mitchell obtained, do they support her claims? The question hung in the air like a legal landmine. Dr. Walsh's records did contain Robert's admissions of manipulative behavior, his confessions about targeting vulnerable employees, and his acknowledgement of the psychological damage he'd inflicted. But those admissions had been made in the sanctuary of therapy, protected by confidentiality laws that Sarah's criminal breach had violated. The recordings contain statements that could be interpreted as admissions of workplace misconduct, Dr. Walsh said carefully. However, they were obtained illegally and would likely be inadmissible in any formal proceedings. Moreover, they represent one person's subjective experience in therapy, not objective facts about workplace behavior. Marcus Thompson entered the conference room at that moment, his military bearing unchanged despite the moral complexity of his position. As Sarah's closest friend and the person who'd tried to warn her away from this path, he carried the heavy burden of someone who'd watched a good person self-destruct. "Marcus, thank you for joining us," Agent Chen said. "We understand you have information about both Ms. Mitchell's activities and Mr. Sterling's workplace behavior." Marcus settled into his chair, his weathered face reflecting the difficult choice between loyalty to Sarah and adherence to his ethical principles. "I witnessed Robert Sterling's psychological attack on Sarah during her performance review. It was calculated, cruel, and designed to destroy her confidence. But I also discovered evidence of Sarah's hacking activities and tried to convince her to stop before she crossed legal lines." "Why didn't you report her activities immediately?" Jennifer asked. "Because I hoped she'd step back on her own. Sarah Mitchell was one of the most ethical people I've ever worked with. Watching her moral compass spin out of control was like watching someone die slowly." Marcus's voice carried genuine pain. "I thought friendship and reason could save her from herself." Agent Chen made another note. "Did Ms. Mitchell ever express intentions to publicly release the stolen recordings?" "She was torn," Marcus admitted. "Part of her wanted revenge, but part of her recognized that exposing Robert's therapy would harm his son. She was struggling with the moral implications right up until the arrest." Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened to admit an unexpected participant, David Sterling. The 16-year-old looked older than his years, his face carrying the premature wisdom of someone forced to navigate adult conflicts that should never have touched his life. "I'm sorry to interrupt," David said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "But I asked Ms. Harrison if I could speak about this situation. It affects me more than anyone else in this room." Jennifer started to object. Having a minor involved in these proceedings created legal complications, but Dr. Walsh intervened. "David, you don't have to do this. You have the right to privacy, to protection from adult conflicts." "No," David interrupted firmly. "Everyone's been making decisions about my life, my family, my father's treatment, and nobody's asked what I want. I think I have the right to speak for myself." Agent Chen glanced at Jennifer, who nodded reluctantly. The teenager's statement could provide crucial context for the case, even if it complicated the legal proceedings. David sat down across from the assembled adults, his composed demeanor belying his youth. "I know my father hurt Ms. Mitchell. I know he's hurt other people too. And I know he's been trying to get help for his problems through therapy with Dr. Walsh." He turned to address Dr. Walsh directly. "The therapy has been helping. Dad's been different at home, still struggling, but actually talking about his problems instead of just acting them out. For the first time since the divorce, I had hope that maybe we could have a real relationship." The room fell silent as David's words landed with devastating impact. This wasn't just about corporate harassment or cybercrimes. It was about a family's fragile healing process that had been caught in the crossfire of adult vengeance. "Ms. Mitchell," David continued, though Sarah wasn't present, "I understand why you're angry. Dad destroyed your confidence, made you feel like you weren't worthy of respect or advancement. But the recordings you stole, they don't just contain evidence of his crimes. They contain evidence of his healing." Marcus leaned forward, recognizing the moral complexity that had tormented Sarah in her final weeks of freedom. "David, what would you want to happen now? If you could decide the outcome?" The teenager was quiet for a long moment, considering a question that no 16-year-old should have to answer. "I want my dad to face consequences for hurting people, but I also want him to keep getting help. And I want Ms. Mitchell to get help too, because what she did, the hacking, the stalking, the obsession, that's not healthy behavior either." Agent Chen made a note about David's request, recognizing that the young man had articulated something the legal system struggled to address: the difference between punishment and healing, between justice and revenge. The legal reality, Agent Chen explained gently, is that Ms. Mitchell has committed serious federal crimes: computer fraud, violation of medical privacy laws, potentially extortion. These carry mandatory minimum sentences. Mr. Sterling's workplace, harassment, while reprehensible, is harder to prosecute given how the evidence was obtained. So she gets destroyed while he gets protected? David asked, his composure finally cracking. That doesn't seem fair either. Jennifer Harrison spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of someone grappling with institutional failure. David, we failed everyone in this situation. We failed to protect Ms. Mitchell from harassment, failed to detect the pattern of abuse. Your father had established and failed to provide adequate channels for addressing workplace toxicity. She turned to Dr. Walsh. Doctor, from a therapeutic perspective, what would serve both your patient and Ms. Mitchell best? Dr. Walsh considered the question carefully, recognizing that her answer could influence the legal proceedings. Both individuals are struggling with psychological damage that expresses itself through harmful behavior toward others. Robert uses manipulation and control. Sarah used technical expertise for surveillance and revenge. Both need treatment, not just punishment. Marcus nodded agreement. Sarah's not a criminal. She's a victim who became a perpetrator. The person who committed those cyber crimes isn't the woman I've worked with for 2 years. She was transformed by trauma and the desire for vindication. But the crimes were still committed, Agent Chen pointed out. Regardless of motivation, federal law was violated repeatedly and deliberately. The door opened again, this time admitting Sarah herself, flanked by her court-appointed attorney. House arrest and pending trial had transformed her appearance. She looked thinner, more fragile, but also somehow cleaner, as if the absence of her obsessive investigation had allowed her to breathe again. Sarah asked to be present for this discussion, her attorney explained. She wants to address the impact of her actions directly. Sarah looked around the table, taking in the faces of people whose lives she'd touched with varying degrees of destruction. When her eyes met David's, she seemed to crumble slightly. "I'm sorry," she said simply, her voice barely audible. "David, I'm so sorry. I became so focused on making your father pay for what he did to me that I forgot you existed as anything other than collateral damage." David nodded, his expression showing a maturity that shouldn't have been necessary. "I know, and I'm sorry my dad hurt you. But Ms. Mitchell, you scared me. When I realized you had all those recordings, all those private details about our family, I felt like we were being stalked by someone we'd never met." "You were," Sarah admitted. "I told myself I was seeking justice, but I became a digital predator. I violated your privacy, your father's medical confidentiality, and Dr. Walsh's professional sanctuary. I became everything I claimed to be fighting against." Dr. Walsh leaned forward, her therapeutic instincts engaging despite the legal complexity of the situation. "Sarah, what changed? What made you recognize the destructive nature of your actions?" "David's text messages," Sarah said immediately. "When he reached out to me, begging me not to destroy what was left of his family, that's when I realized I wasn't fighting Robert Sterling anymore. I was fighting a 16-year-old boy who was trying to heal from his father's damage." Agent Chen made notes, recognizing that Sarah's statement could be crucial for determining intent and potential for rehabilitation. "I want to make this right," Sarah continued. "I know I can't undo the privacy violations or the fear I caused, but I want to delete everything I stole, cooperate fully with the investigation, and accept whatever consequences the court decides." Her attorney shot her a warning look, but Sarah continued. "And I want to get help, real help, not just legal defense. Because David's right, what I did wasn't healthy behavior. I need to understand how someone with my values could cross so many ethical lines. The room fell silent as everyone processed Sarah's admission. The adversarial dynamic that had driven weeks of escalating conflict was finally giving way to something approaching mutual recognition of shared humanity. David was the first to speak. Ms. Mitchell, if you really delete everything and get help, and if my dad keeps working on his problems in therapy, maybe something good can come from this disaster. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it certainly wasn't justice in any traditional sense. But it was recognition that healing sometimes required moving beyond the simple calculus of crime and punishment toward the more complex work of rebuilding broken trust and damaged relationships. The reckoning had begun, and its outcome would depend on whether the participants could find a path between accountability and compassion, between consequences and redemption. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of a different conference room. This one in the federal courthouse, where justice wore a more complex face than anyone had anticipated. Sarah Mitchell sat beside her attorney, wearing the navy dress her mother had sent for the sentencing hearing. The woman who had once commanded Sterling Tech's cybersecurity infrastructure now faced 18 months in federal prison, followed by supervised probation and community service focused on digital literacy education. The plea agreement had been harsh but fair, acknowledging both the severity of her crimes and the circumstances that had led to them. Across the courtroom, Robert Sterling sat with his own legal team, his corporate confidence replaced by something approaching humility. The workplace harassment investigation had resulted in his termination from Sterling Tech, along with a substantial financial settlement for Sarah and the 3 other employees whose experiences had finally come to light. His therapy sessions, with Dr. Walsh continued, now focused on rebuilding the relationship with his son and understanding the patterns that had made him a workplace predator. Judge Patricia Morrison reviewed the sentencing documents one final time before addressing the court. This case represents a troubling intersection of technological capability and human frailty. Ms. Mitchell, your technical expertise allowed you to commit sophisticated crimes, but your actions were driven by legitimate grievances against a system that failed to protect you. Sarah stood as the judge continued. However, the violation of medical privacy, the breach of cybersecurity protocols, and the invasion of personal communications cannot be excused by the injustices you suffered. The law exists to prevent exactly this kind of digital vigilantism, regardless of motivation. The sentence was delivered with judicial precision: 18 months incarceration, 3 years supervised probation, and 500 hours of community service, teaching cybersecurity ethics to disadvantaged communities. It was punishment, but also recognition that Sarah's expertise could serve society rather than destroy it. Dr. Amanda Walsh watched from the gallery, her own professional journey forever changed by the breach of her practice. She had implemented new security protocols and moved toward encrypted, offline record-keeping that would prevent future violations. More importantly, she had begun speaking at conferences about the intersection of digital privacy and therapeutic practice, turning her victimization into advocacy for patient protection. Marcus Thompson sat beside her. His friendship with Sarah strained but not broken. He had transferred to the private sector, where his military cybersecurity experience was valued without the corporate politics that had enabled Robert's predatory behavior. His testimony during the investigation had been crucial in establishing the pattern of workplace harassment that had driven Sarah to her crimes. Jennifer Harrison remained at Sterling Tech, now as Chief Ethics Officer rather than HR Director. The company had implemented comprehensive anti-harassment protocols, mandatory psychological evaluations for management positions, and anonymous reporting systems designed to prevent the kind of institutional failure that had precipitated the crisis. Her role had evolved from protecting corporate interests to genuinely protecting employees. But it was David Sterling whose presence in the courtroom carried the most emotional weight. Now 17, he had spent the past months in family therapy with his father, working to rebuild a relationship that had been damaged by years of emotional manipulation and neglect. The stolen recordings that had nearly destroyed their family had, paradoxically, provided a roadmap for healing by forcing them to confront the truth of their dysfunction. When Judge Morrison invited victim impact statements, David approached the podium with the composure that had carried him through the investigation. Your Honor, both Ms. Mitchell and my father were victims and perpetrators in this situation. Dad hurt people because he was hurt, and Ms. Mitchell hurt people because she was hurt. The cycle only stops when someone chooses healing over revenge. He turned to address Sarah directly. Ms. Mitchell, what you did scared me and violated my family's privacy, but it also forced us to face problems we'd been ignoring. Dad's getting real help now, and we're learning to have an honest relationship. I don't forgive what you did, but I understand why you did it. Sarah wiped away tears as David concluded. I hope prison gives you time to heal the way therapy has helped my dad heal, and I hope when you get out, you use your skills to protect people instead of hunting them. The courtroom fell silent as David returned to his seat, his words carrying a wisdom that transcended his years. Judge Morrison nodded approvingly before delivering her final statement. This case demonstrates that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about breaking cycles of harm and creating opportunities for redemption. Ms. Mitchell, you will serve your sentence, but you will also have the chance to rebuild your life in service to the digital security you once violated. As the proceedings concluded, Sarah caught David's eye across the courtroom. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them. Not forgiveness, but recognition of shared humanity. Both had been casualties of adult warfare. Both had been forced to grow beyond their years, and both would carry the scars of this experience forward. Outside the courthouse, Dr. Walsh approached Sarah before the marshals led her away. Sarah, when you're ready, there are therapeutic programs. In prison, real healing is possible, even after everything that's happened. Sarah nodded, understanding finally that digital vindication had never been about the data she'd stolen or the secrets she'd uncovered. True vindication lay in choosing healing over revenge, accountability over victimhood, and service over self-destruction. The sun set on a complex resolution where no one had won completely, but everyone had the opportunity to emerge from the wreckage as better versions of themselves. Justice, it turned out, was less about perfect outcomes and more about imperfect people finding ways to grow beyond their worst impulses. In the end, Sarah Mitchell's greatest hack had been learning to reprogram herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.